right, it's 3:30, so I want to honor everyone's time, and we'll go ahead and get started. I am Stephanie Crawford. I am the Executive Director for IDEA. We're so happy to have you here today for the panel that we are going to start. Sorry, sometimes when I'm admitting people, I can't always talk and do that at the same time, so that's my apology there. But I am really excited to welcome these panelists for the end of Arab American Heritage Month. I think it is so impactful when we can center those voices, right, and truly learn from their perspectives. And so I appreciate you all being here to learn with us today about how we can meet the needs of our Arab students. And what I would like is for our four panelists to introduce themselves. And then I have a few questions prepared, so we'll go through. At the end, I'll give enough time for you to ask any questions that you might have after that conversation has happened. So feel free to put things in the chat if you need to and unmute. We're just really excited to be learning with all of you today. And this is being recorded, so you will be able to access the recording again. And at the very end, I will drop the link for the PDH into the chat. All right, without further ado, let's get started. Sosin, would you like to go ahead and start?
Sure. I am not new to the IDEA family. So if you've been a part of IDEA and you're at the conference, and you've probably seen me and seen my students presenting. My name is Zainab Jabak. I am an English teacher at District 212 Leiden, East Leiden High School. I consider myself an equity advocate, and I believe very strongly in activating student voices to speak their own truths and kind of share their stories. As a part of that too, I've tried to really work as an advocate for our Arab community. I'm one of the co-founders of the Arab American Educators Network, which is a national network. I'm working with the state of Illinois, the home to the largest Arab population in our country, currently statistically, to start some affinity spaces for Arab teachers and to start some formal advocacy for Arab students in the public sector. So I've been working on a state level with some of these committees in order for us to really get that work going on a more, I guess, a more state and national level in more formal ways, as opposed to kind of suggested ideas of really advocating. And so I'm really excited to be here to share some of our lived experiences and some of the ways that you can support Arab students in your classrooms. So thank you for being here.
Mona, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's definitely an honor to be here with you guys. My name is Mona Mustafa. I've been a teacher for the past 10 years. And this is my first time teaching in a public school. I'm working in Paterson, New Jersey, which is also historically, has had a large population of Arab American immigration. I think the population is estimated right now at 100,000 Arab Americans from the different countries that can be represented. And I'm teaching social studies. And this year, for the first time, I've had a really unique experience. I'm getting certified in Arabic language. So it's been so beautiful to share my language and my culture with my non-native Arabic students. So it's really beautiful. And the cross-cultural bonds that we're creating are something that I really want to share with you all. So hopefully we can all get to feel what it's like to learn about somebody else's culture and language. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Zainab, how about you?
Hi, I'm Zainab Jabak. It is so great to be with you guys here today. Thank you guys for giving me space. I'm a high school English teacher here in Houston, Texas. I teach sophomores, English 2 with some pre-AP sections. And I currently am a huge advocate for culturally responsive literacy and text in our classroom spaces. I know I have like a huge expanse behind me of books, but I'm a proud owner of over 1,000 books in my classroom library, and that number is growing. I currently have a Project Lit chapter where I have student leaders take charge and ownership of their own literacy journeys, and they in turn empower their peers at my campus. And I'm just really excited to be with you guys here today.
Thank you. And last but not least, Kefah, would you care to introduce yourself?
Can you guys see me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kefah Ayesh. I am a secondary English teacher. I'm also head of my department at a private school in Wayne, New Jersey. I'm also finishing up my master's in writing and English studies with a focus on poetic memoirs and storytelling. I'm very passionate about inclusivity in writing, and I feel that storytelling is such a powerful way to be heard and seen. And I'm a proud advocate for marginalized voices.
Great to have all of you here. You might also have recognized Kefah's name from a blog that she wrote to help us kick off Arab American Heritage Month. And if you haven't seen that, I highly recommend you read that, check it out on our website, because her voice really is a poetic voice that comes through in her writing. So we appreciated that blog that you wrote for us too. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So we have the first question, and I don't care however you would like to kind of round robin this around. If one question kind of grabs you more, please feel free to just add in what you feel needs to be added. So first question I'd like to ask is, what macroaggressions do you face as Arab teachers?
I think I'll speak to that one because that's been very personal experience for me in a lot of different places. It's one of the reasons why my doctoral research really centered on highlighting the experiences of Arab American students in historically homogenous school districts, because I feel like it is, I always call it the untold story of a demographic that's hypervisible when it comes to marginalization and bullying, but invisible when it comes to a lot of the advocacy in schools. And so I think it started from being in a district where there was a 600% growth of Arabs in the community, and a teacher approached me on a Monday morning to ask me how I felt after what my people did in France, referencing an ISIS bombing. And it was an indication of the conflation and misunderstanding of Arab and Muslim identities, of extremist Islam versus Islam in its authentic form, and all of these different kind of ideas. But my immediate thought went to, if this is the perception and what she sees when she sees my hijab and my physical, kind of the hyphens of my identity when she looks at me, how is that impacting students, and how is she perpetuating harm when she's interacting with kids who look like me every single day? And I think as time has progressed and I have grown in my advocacy and taken on higher leadership roles in the public sector, it's become more and more apparent how much misunderstanding there is around Arab identities and around Muslim identities, and the differences between those two identities in general. And I've had things like, I've had an administrator last year approach me and say, your Palestinian identity is offensive, can you tone it down? And so again, my first thought was, I work in a district where there are 18 Palestinian kids in the district, where there's not a lot of Arabs, but the Arabs that are here, they're primarily Palestinian. And so if this is our perception in a department where we have the opportunity to really create those authentic mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors for students, then how is that kind of translating through curriculum, through student interaction? How is it perpetuating harm? I don't believe that educators in any school space intentionally perpetuate harm, but I think that really requires us to really think about well-intentioned negative impact that happens on students, especially when we are not taking the time to really immerse ourselves in understanding those identities that are intentionally misrepresented in a lot of the media and curriculum. And so one of the biggest things that we noticed when we did like a quick survey is that most public schools are teaching the Kite Runner as an Arab text when the author himself isn't even Arab. And again, it's a misunderstanding, but what is the impact of teaching a novel like The Kite Runner as representative of Arab students in the classroom when we know that these texts are working to elevate fear around these identities, and we're not doing the work to really create a more critical understanding of how the text operates in a classroom space. So I think that there's tons and tons of examples that I can share just based on my own lived experiences, based on my children. My daughter was asked to apologize for 9/11 in front of her English classroom in a public school. I mean, it's something that like is shocking to even think that a teacher feels like a student should apologize for something that massive and that huge. But again, it's the misunderstanding and conflation of these identities and a lack of access or a lack of intentionality behind doing the work to really understand and disrupt in school spaces through curriculum and through other things. Thank you.
It's hard to imagine people feeling empowered to say those things, you know, without a care, as if it's a normal reaction. Does anybody else have anything to add to that question about macroaggressions that you faced as Arab teachers?
I'd like to add something, and it goes along with what Sosan was saying. Because a lot of our students are so used to just hearing and learning about those stereotypical images of Arabs and Arabs as people in their novels and in their texts and on the media that they're exposed to, it does trickle down into the things that they say to their fellow classmates. So I do hear a lot of that when it comes to my students between one another. And, the macroaggressions would be, using the terms that are perpetuated in these stereotypes, using words like terrorist, using that type of language. And you kind of, it hurts you to see, your Arab student have to suffer in that way. They feel this need to apologize, like Dr. Sosin said with her daughter. She's a child, and no child should ever be made to feel so unsafe to have to apologize for something like that. So, it's important for us to be having this conversation, and that's why we appreciate it so much, because the only other conversations that are being had are, I'm an English teacher teaching the kite runner and saying this is what an Arab is, even though it's completely, the opposite of the correct representation.
So if we have educators in here who aren't maybe sure what a microaggression is versus a macroaggression, how would you explain that to them?
I don't know if there's a formal term for a macroaggression. I call them macroaggressions because they're life defining, right? Like when we call them micro, they almost feel like they're small, but these are moments that really define people's trajectories and their life experiences. And I call this the hidden curriculum, right? Like that's what we're experiencing. And a lot of times without naming these things, it does set the perception that a lot of students who come to school as sponges, I always tell my students, like, you're creating this invisible lens based on this hidden curriculum. And you are then walking through life and you're looking through this invisible lens when you're interacting with other people. It defines your relationships with people. And so they're not macro by any means, because they are experiences that define self-concept. They're experiences that define perceptions of other people and how we vote and what we're accept. Like when the Muslim ban happened, there wasn't an outrage on how that is something that is un-American, right? When these laws that are happening in states like Texas, censoring or even stopping people from acting on things like BDS and other, very, very specific targeted laws that are silencing groups of people, we're not outraged because we feel like there's a perception that's been created that Arabs and Muslims are un-American, they can't coexist. The values of many Arabs and Muslims are perceived to be in contention directly with American values. And so although they're coined as microaggressions, they're not micro by any means, because they're defining moments in a lot of things for people in many very serious ways.
Thank you. I really appreciate that description. I think that helps someone who really wasn't sure, what would be the difference? Why the difference in terminology? And I think the words carry a lot of power. And so the idea that micro versus macro, I absolutely agree with that. We did have a question. Bruce asked you, Sosin, did the teacher who made the student, your daughter, do this, get disciplined for this?
No, we advocated, we tried. She was retiring that year, and the administration's big thing was we've never had a complaint about her before, but the more we kind of dug into and spoke to students, their lived experiences said very differently. And kids who were really successful classes across the board before her class, after her class, and in other classes were really struggling to obtain decent grades in her class if they were of Arab identity and descent. But unfortunately, because it was her last year, the school wasn't willing to take any kind of action or even address it in any way. It was brushed under the rug, and the school apologized and it was called a day. That was the end of it.
Wow. It's unbelievable in so many ways, but okay, there's just nothing to say. What are some of the most common challenges that Arab American students face in American schools, and how can teachers help to address them?
I think the biggest thing would be very simple, which is fitting in. I know Southside has always said, anytime that we've spoken, we just want to fit in. And when you are Arab or you come from a marginalized group, you carry your heritage, you carry your history with you. And so, for example, for me growing up, being an American Lebanese, growing up in Dallas, Texas, I knew I was Arab. I knew I was Lebanese. I spoke my language that my parents passed down on to me. I have a very ethnic Arabic name. And at the time I wasn't wearing my hijab. And so a lot of people, when they would see me, they assumed I passed off either as Hispanic or it really just depended. My best friend's mother would come up to me and would speak to me in Spanish when she first met me because she thought I was Hispanic at first. I remember in the 3rd grade, I was so excited to wear my hijab to school. I remember walking in and I was a fairly good student. I feel like I did my work. I was polite. I was respectful. I feel like I would have been a lot of teachers' favorite students, I'm just saying. But I remember I walked in and I remember walking into the door and having this sense of like excitement, yet uncertainty of what's going to happen, because I was going into a space that I was comfortable in with a part of my identity. And my 3rd grade teacher looked at me when I first walked in. I was at the door, and it's really hard to describe what that look was. It's a look I'll never forget. It's something that's engraved into my brain. It was confusion, uncertainty, but when I reflect on it, I feel like it reaffirmed or reminded my teacher of not only that I was Arab, but that I was also Muslim. And this was post 9/11. This was in 2007. And so it hadn't been that long. I went back and I reflected, and that teacher was a very new teacher at the time because I wanted to know. I thought it was my fault. And for the longest, like for the rest of that school year, things just weren't the same. And that was a defining moment for me, because in schools, whether that be abroad or, here in the States, that moment became a very defining moment. That am I accepted, or am I invited into these spaces, or am I going to get exiled? And our students today, I teach at a predominantly Latinx school. And so our Arab population is a minority within a minority. They're a very small group, and they just want to belong. And it's very alienating when you feel all these pressures and you've experienced a lot of exile from adult figures and from educational figures in your life, to have that sense of belonging.
I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Please go.
No, I think that the research shows that 1 in 3 Arab students is bullied by a teacher. That's the statistic.
Yeah.
And so if we want to think about the implications of that, I don't know if it's so much as fitting in, because fitting in requires that you are shedding some of your identity markers in order to assimilate, as much as it is they want to feel like they can diminish that sense of duality that's born out of feeling like you are not welcome into a space. And so you have to, what I found is, if we're looking at the kind of the checkpoints of what is a successful student that feels like they belong, a lot of these kids are kids who are successful grades academically. They're participating in extracurricular activities. They are, on the surface, we can say that these are kids who are integrated into our districts and they're doing fine. But when you take that street data, that qualitative data, and have these conversations with them, the process of thinking about what parts of myself do I share, what parts of myself do I hold back, how do I present myself physically? If I am somebody who shares the intersectionality of being a Muslim and an Arab, physically in a space where I am minoritized within a minority, or even if there is a majority of us, but there's a negative sense of self-concept and understanding towards who I am, like the district that my kids go to, there's 38% Arab students, but they're constantly dealing with like spray painting in the bathrooms, kill all Arabs, or like things like that, where it's a really antagonistic culture towards Arab students, which, even though there's a majority of students that look like them, it's still not a safe space or a brave space, or whatever kind of space you want to create, a space that invites kids to bring their cultural and linguistic pluralism into that space and really be who they are. So I think there's a really big difference between asking kids to fit in and then asking us, creating a space where we're saying, bring your native language and trans language when you're creating a literature piece. If you speak Arabic, use Arabic in your poetry in order for you to communicate. Wear your hijab, and we're going to kind of understand and celebrate things like Ramadan and Eid and all of these different things that are very big markers, and like Arab Heritage Month. I think I reached out to 20 organizations, including Microsoft, Google, that I've worked with in the last 3 years. And unanimously, not a single organization has ever held an event, a webinar, written an article or a blog for Arab Heritage Month. Meanwhile, and I personally don't believe in celebrating months. I think these are conversations we should be having all year. But if this is what's going to bring these issues and these identities to the platform, then we're going to leverage that and use it. But why is it happening for every other group? Unless we're advocating, we know that this is a huge, growing population, statistically the largest in Illinois currently. Why are we not advocating for these kids without having to be held accountable by the members of that group?
Mm-hmm.
What I
It's
really
that sense of
appreciate,
belonging. And I like that you brought that up. So it's that sense of belonging that you want to feel like you belong in that space. And it just becomes so difficult to do because, oh my gosh, sorry. I have one thing you brought up that I wanted to add. I just like completely had a brain fart. So I'm just going to mute myself until I remember.
I was going to say, please come back with it. I want to say I really appreciate that you talked about the difference in wanting to fit in and then actually just wanting to be acknowledged for who you are and that that's okay. I see a parallel with neurodivergent students there too, where it's the equivalent of asking them to mask to fit into a neurotypical world. And we know that that's not okay, that we need to be moving away from that. So why are we okay expecting our groups of Arab students to somehow mask who they are to fit into that, you know, westernized space? So I love the example that you gave there, because I think it really kind of helped click home in a lot of different instances how that's the difference between wanting to actually be liked for who you are and acknowledged for who you are versus changing, you know, to be accepted. Did you think of it? You're gonna come back. Oh, you'll think of it and then you'll tell us. I know it. Okay, so you've brought up really good points there about the struggles that the Arab students are going through. Do you have a suggestion for how a teacher can help to address that? What does a teacher need to do in order to realize, because it sounds like that's some internal things that are happening with the teacher, right? So what is a good start for a teacher to kind of figure out, am I doing this to my students?
I'll chime in. I think it really starts with those first few weeks of school and, you know, just building that rapport with all of your students in general, right? It's really important for us as teachers to prioritize getting to know who our students are and what they love about themselves. And, you know, for me personally, I have always loved, you know, talking to people about my Palestinian identity. And wearing things that represent my identity. For example, like tatriz. And even right now, I'm wearing my lanyard. It's a fabric that comes from Palestine. So I talk to my students if they ask, what is that? What is that striped thing that you're wearing? And I use it as an opportunity to build those connections with them. But from the beginning of our school year, it's more important to, you know, just ask students what they love about their identity, what they love about their culture. Do they speak another language? In those first surveys that, if anybody here gives out surveys in the beginning of the year, what other languages do you speak? Where do you come from? What is your favorite thing about your culture, your country? And then have kids share, right? And if you're opening the floor to every single one of your students, it's not like you're singling, like you're saying, hey, you're Arab, so you have to talk about being Arab. Everyone is talking openly about who they are and where they come from. So it's the perfect opportunity. And I would say, just like you guys mentioned before, even though we're happy that we have Arab Heritage Month and it's a perfect opportunity, it's so beautiful. And for me, it's like a dream come true to see this, you know, because I come from a family of, you know, second generation people who, and my uncle and my mother and all of them before me worked hard. They've connected with legislators. They've tried for years and years and years. And now 20 years later, we're seeing the progress that their efforts, you know, are growing into. So it's really beautiful opportunity, but we have to kind of normalize the inclusion of Arab voices throughout the year. And there's so many ways to do that in every subject across so many disciplines. So art, there are many artists, and when we share our resources at the end, there's different categories that you guys will be able to look into. Palestinian, Syrian, Lebanese, Yemeni, across so many different countries and in the Middle East, there's voices that you can bring out. And like I said, you never have to single it out. We're talking about Arabs today. It's not like that. We're talking about poetry today, and here is Amar Effendum, a spoken word artist who is going to speak openly about growing up in neighborhoods like Brooklyn with other immigrants, with other children of immigrants or marginalized people, elbow to elbow. And the way these artists speak about their lived experiences really does translate and become, much easier for us to teach to our students, So through the artists, through the work, through the writing pieces that we share in our classrooms, there's many opportunities where we can start to give our students this pride in their identity, I would say.
And I absolutely love that, Mona. I'm so sorry, Stephanie, go ahead. I apologize.
No, please, you're the panelist. I want to hear your voice.
Okay. I absolutely love what Mona said. But I think before we include those pieces, before we act on, and before we ensure that our practices in our classrooms are culturally responsive, I think we as educators have a responsibility to self-reflect and to constantly, address and evaluate, everyone has an unconscious bias. It doesn't matter, a lot of my, the assumption is that if you're from a marginalized group, you don't have an unconscious bias. Everyone has an unconscious bias. And at the end of the day, it falls on, what are my unconscious biases towards a group of people? Why do I have those biases, and where are they coming from? Where are they stemming from? I mean, if you just watch regular news, regardless of the news channel, anytime that Arabs or Muslims are brought into the conversation, it's not usually anything positive. And we talk about the constant unrest that is abroad and that is in the Middle East and the Arab world, and that civil unrest wasn't always there. And I know that Southson talks a lot about, why do we focus in on those things so much? For me, I always tell students, it's really important that you expose yourself to different groups. And in my school district, they are exposed to that, and we are able to draw in from different cultures and different backgrounds. Recently, we were reading The Alchemist, and Santiago, coming in from Spain, he's trying to get to Egypt, and he has to travel, within North Africa. He has to first go to Morocco. And the concepts of Mediterranean winds and what does that mean, and the Arab world and language and culture, the geographic context, those were all things that a lot of my students really struggled to grasp. And it was really eye-opening to see, okay, my students know I'm Arab, but they have a problem distinguishing what does the term Middle Eastern mean? How is that different from an Arab? Where does the term Middle Eastern come from? How is my teacher Lebanese, but also Mediterranean? And and how is that different between being a North African Arab and an Asian Arab? And how, it was a whole conversation, right? And a lot of my students were like, when I asked them what they thought an Arab was or what do they look like, I had a lot of stereotypical responses. And when I asked them, okay, why do you think the way that you do? Where are we getting this information from? They're like, well, this is what I see it on TV. Or this is what I see on my For You page on TikTok. This is, and our kids are being exposed to these various forms of media. And so teaching them how to evaluate those sources becomes really imperative. And I think it's only when we are, us as educators, evaluate our own biases that we can start to address those in our classrooms.
Yeah, I'm going to add to that and say too, it's not just, definitely everything that you said is so important. And also, positionality. Where do you position yourself, right? How we're positioned in positions of power when we're coming into a classroom as educators. And whether we like to admit it or not, we make choices. We're the gatekeepers of a lot of things. We decide what goes into a classroom. We decide how to respond to a student when they're bringing a piece of themselves into the space, whether we create that space to allow them to bring themselves in or not. We're making decisions every single day. So we are the gatekeepers. But how you position yourselves outside of a classroom space absolutely impacts how you show up in your classroom. So one of the questions that we asked a group of administrators I was working with and training is, if you think about your social circles, how many people do you have in your social circle that you interact with regularly that don't look like you? 90% of the administrators in that space said they didn't have anyone who didn't look like them in their social circles. How can you serve such growing diversity in our schools today if in your own social circles you're not interacting with people and immersing yourselves in diversity? What work are we doing to, I mean, we've all been socialized by the same school curriculum. It's almost impossible to talk about Arabs and without talking about Muslims, because to most Americans, those two identities are conflated and they're used synonymously, right? Arabs are people who come from 20 plus Arab speaking countries, and they can be any religion. Muslims are people who follow the same faith and can come from any ethnic background, any racial background, right? Islam has existed. 50% of the slaves that were bought through the transatlantic trade were Muslim. So Islam has existed since the inception of our country. The contributions of Muslims are something that we can talk about when we talk about the contributions of our Black community to the United States. Arabs only show up in curriculum when it comes to, and Muslims when it comes to 9/11, when it comes to the Ottoman Empire. Both of those are brought through a negative light. Nowhere else in curriculum is there often conversation about who these people are and the many, many contributions they've made to the sciences, to the math, to language, to the letters, to the numbers, to poetry, right? Poetry is something that's existed in the Arab culture since the beginning of time. So these are things that we need to first go out and unlearn so that we can relearn. And that's not going to happen if we are not activating all of our students' voices. And instead of me deciding, for example, as an English teacher, what is a culturally responsive text for my students and choosing something like the Kite Runner, again, well-intentioned, harmful impact, then I am saying to the students, how can I get you to be a co-designer and a content creator and really elevate your lived experiences as a piece of content that then every student in that classroom becomes a resource. And I'm not the gatekeeper anymore, right? These are kids who are creating, and the mirrors that they're creating are accurate mirrors of their lived experiences. By producing these outputs, then they are creating windows for other kids to learn about them. And these are accurate windows. And I'm not putting the pressure of my Arab student and saying, hey, can you teach me about your culture or your heritage? Because no student wants to be their teacher's teacher. Kids just want to belong, especially at adolescent ages. We can see that there's a direct correlation between research showing that kids who belong show much greater gains academically. So when they don't belong, it affects them academically. If schools are meant to serve students from an academic lens, how are we disservicing kids that we know we're setting up to not feel like they belong, right? And so the best way to give them space to belong is by giving them the opportunity to create as a whole. And we're learning about each other, but what's happening is we're creating these really strong communities. And I say, like, today, as the only country in the world that is plagued with mass shootings on a daily basis, our country's broken, right? We have so much healing to do as a people. And I think that the more we talk about these conversations, we have this like intentional effort to weaponize a lot of this work. We need to really stop and take a step back and look at the interest convergence we have in healing our country and doing this work, because it is not Black and brown students who are coming into schools and shooting students, right? It is white students. And the research shows that a lot of these white kids are white kids who feel like they also don't belong. And so when we talk about the scholarship behind integrating and including students, it's work that includes every single student in your classroom space. It's not work that is asking teachers to elevate one group of students over the other. And we have seen that historically. Black scholarship, the most marginalized group in our history as a country, always has advocated for things that would impact everyone, right? It wasn't just things that would elevate and impact the Black community, but things that, if implemented, would have made our country, our schools, safer places and better places. This isn't any different. And so it really starts with the teachers who are showing up in the spaces and are sitting at decision-making tables, writing policies, writing referrals, calling parents. You can either really elevate and make a student love themselves and have this really strong self-concept that they'll take with them everywhere. And I think every single teacher in this space can look back and say, I remember that teacher. And that's why many of us become teachers because of that person, right? Or people who run away from education because it becomes a place of trauma. And all of a sudden you really need to leave all of those identity markers, sometimes permanently, because you feel like you can't own them. So I think it really starts with that self-interrogation and thinking about how you position yourself in order for you to really unlearn. Because if we don't start to humanize these historically criminalized groups, we can do whatever we want to do in classroom spaces. It's still going to be well-intentioned, harmful impact. That's what it's going to end up because we don't know better.
All of you, very impactful answers there. I appreciate that. Several things that stand out, and what it really sounds like when we look at what you're saying for teachers to take that start is that they need to examine their bias first, right? That's like their first step, because you can't really do anything until you examine where are you coming from. And then to be able to move forward with not trying to single out the Arab students as a group. I particularly, Mona, it stuck with me that you said, not teaching it as like, let's look at Arab writers, let's look at Arab artists. Like, these are writers, these are artists, and they happen to be looking from a different perspective. I love that. I think some of the newest textbooks, even in literature, are grouping together marginalized voices. And it's like, why are you doing that? So I think that point, Mona, was really impactful. And then being able to, I just want to make sure again that we're hearing those main points, that once you realize that you can't single out a group in your intent to try to lift them up, because that only causes more harm, that you then need to find a way to normalize in your classroom that everyone has a voice, and it's not that you're elevating one group over the other, it's that you're listening to all the voices. Am I kind of correct in that summary? That was really impactful. Thank you. I do want to point out, Susan put a comment in here. She said her mic isn't functioning. So she wanted to add this, that one of the hallmarks of Arab American culture is the value of family. I believe that it opens opportunities for great conversations about family, traditions, foods, holidays, etc. Finding commonality can help build bonds and appreciation. I would love to know, what are some effective strategies for building trust and rapport with Arab American students and their families?
I'll talk about an icebreaker that I do sometimes with some of my students, because I feel like, much like a lot of the panelists have said, that when you single out students, it doesn't really make them want to speak up. So what I do is we do a writing prompt, and the prompt is simply, how does your family make rice? And everyone goes around the room and they talk about the different ways they make rice. And it's astounding to me every time, even when I have students of the same ethnic background, they make it in such different ways. And that sparks such amazing conversation about culture and food and the connectivity of food and how the food brings families together. So I think sometimes it's these really simple ways that reminds us we're all just human, right? And we all love this idea of family gatherings and food, but there are these little things that make us unique, and those things help us learn from each other.
I really like that you brought up that icebreaker, Kefah, because I do something similar at the beginning of the year. And I did write about, if you've read the article that I wrote for 30 Days of Arab Voices, you can see the correlation, but I like to do a, like your name as a history, where students are able to really, not, I guess dissect is a wrong word, but really just go back to the history of their name, their full name. And they can choose if they want to share their middle name, if they have two last names, they're able to share what they want. If they just want to do their first name, that's totally fine. But students are able to first write their name, write the attributions, the heritage, the culture, the language, and all these different components, regardless of where they come from, they're able to explore their name, and they get to talk about it. And I remember when I did this as an adult, and I did it with my state Texas affiliate for English teachers, I remember doing it as an adult, and I'm like, this is pretty cool. Like, a lot of people ask me what my name means, but I actually get to like really talk about it and reflect about my family and my values and my heritage and my culture and my language. And I did it in such a short amount of time, and it was so impactful. And I got to learn from someone else who shares a different background than I do. And I was able to learn all these different things that make them who they are. And, you know, it's really hard being the only Arab student in a classroom. It's really hard. It's hard walking in and being the only visibly Muslim Arab student in a classroom. In a lot of professional and organization spaces, I was always the only one that looked like me. And I remember when I first met Sausan at the NCTE homecoming event in Kentucky, I remember I was sitting down with my state affiliate members, And I remember looking across the room and I was like, oh my gosh, there's another one. And they all like freaked out and they were like, what do you mean? What's going on? Like, there's another hijabi. And I like freaked out because for as long as I knew, I was the only Muslim, Arab, visibly Muslim hijabi teacher on campus, conferences, organization spaces. And I, to an extent, I really disliked it because anytime I was praised for something, I didn't know if I was being praised because I was just genuinely good at it, or if it was because I was Arab, because they had never seen anyone that looked like me do this before. And to see someone that looked like me doing all the things, because Selson is amazing, I was like, this is so cool. But when you're in a classroom space and you've never had a teacher that looks like you, and you don't see a lot of students that look like you, it can be really isolating. The only thing I can say is to just practice empathy and exposure, and to just be compassionate, and to just be open to learning, because they're just kids. They're not going to be open to you when they first meet you. It's a lot of work. And that goes for any kid, not just an Arab student.
Does that connect with Sosan's point earlier about your intent and your impact being two different things, right? Like if a teacher is maybe even unconsciously trying to build up their one Arab student in the classroom, but instead it feels isolating and singles them out, those are things they have to be aware of too. Would that be correct, that that's actually causing more harm in a situation like that?
Oh yeah. And I'm not saying, like, you could have good intentions, but sometimes there's more harm done than good. I've had, like, in my 3 years of teaching, I've had one Arab student in in one class period per year. This year I have two, and they're in two different class periods. Some are very open, and I remember she is visibly Muslim and she is Arab. And I remember she did her project and she put a word in Arabic. She had to choose a word. And she told me, and she was so open. She told me, I speak Arabic and this is a language that I speak and that I'm proud of. And that was on day one. But then I have another student and he's Arab and he's Muslim, but he's shunned away from his identity a lot. And he wouldn't open up about it or talk about it. And even went back to his name, like the simplicities, which is like your name. And when other kids would ask him how his name was pronounced or why he doesn't go by his first name, and it's harder to lump all the Arab kids and say, this is how you can approach Arab kids. Which is why I say, like, yeah, approaching it with empathy and exposure, and just being mindful that you may have good intentions, but approaching it just from a general standpoint can do some harm. Because they're not all the same. They all have their different experiences and stories. I know Muna, Kefah, Selson, and I, we're all Arab, but we, like, as you can tell and see, we've each had our own experiences that have molded us into the people that we are today.
Yeah,
So what do you think a good way to address families and getting trust from your Arab families? How can teachers go about that? Because I know that in general, it can be difficult building family relationships for educators, in general, but specifically for Arab families, if you are not Arab, are there suggestions that you have for teachers to make better connections with families?
I think there's an assumption in education that self-advocacy is something that everybody should a skill that we should all have, right? And the reality is that self-advocacy is a learned skill. If we look at culture and history, Arabs don't come from democratic backgrounds. And so self-advocacy is something that has to be learned. I think one of the hardest one of the biggest challenges that we faced as a part of the Arab American Educators Network is really activating the community voice in a lot of these districts where there's a lot of Arab parents already, really getting the community to partake and actively holding these schools accountable, modifying curriculum. It's been a challenge. And so I think creating spaces where we are meeting the community where the community is, as opposed to having the community come to us. Language can sometimes be a barrier, right? Making sure that the language is accessible, giving parents the opportunities to learn the skills and to develop the skills that they need in order for them to partake in advocacy, whatever that looks like, intentionally seeking the voices that are missing at the table and inviting them to come in and explaining to them what that advocacy looks like and how important it is. I think oftentimes we assume that if a general email or survey goes out, right, and parents aren't responding, and I've heard these comments, they don't care, they don't want to be a part of their kids. And it's not that I know I come from my parents were refugees. There was nothing more important to my parents than our education, but I can say confidently that they didn't know how to be a part of our education. They held us accountable. They made sure that we had space to study. They gave us all the tools that we needed at home. But as far as they were concerned, that was all they could do when their kids were going to school, studying that in a context that was completely different from something that they were familiar with. And so I always say, like, if as schools we're not serving these communities and giving parents the tools to play an active role with their kids, and we're just making the assumption that they should have these skills and be able to do it, then it's a shortcoming. We're unintentionally leaving them, not giving them space to giving them a seat at the table. And so I think that intentionality of also gauging and speaking to these communities and saying, what can we do? What do you need in order for us to really bring you to the table? That street data, again, like really going out and being intentional about where we're getting the data, because it's often our most active parents that are going to advocate and speak up. And those are the ones that are filling out the surveys. And then we're making database decisions on who's filling out the surveys, but it's not our most marginalized groups or our most silenced groups that are participating. So I would say, I think making sure that we are actively seeking the input from these parents, meeting them where they are, even if it means that we have to go to mosques or we have to go to community centers or we have to go to some of these spaces for all of our marginalized groups, not just Arab students, but really going out of the school to bring them in and invite them in. And then once we invite them in, making sure that language and culture are things that we understand and that we're actively integrating into whatever it is the space that we're bringing them into. I think those are all really important things when we're thinking about the larger context.
Great points. Thank you. Did anybody else have anything to add in that before we move to the next? I just want to make sure I'm giving everybody their space to speak. Okay. I know one of the questions I had planned on asking was about the resources and materials that are available to help teachers better understand and support their Arab American students. But I see that, of course, our panelists have anticipated this and put together a wakelet. It looks like, Sosin, that you added one that can be for the 30 Days of Arab Voices blog, right? Which I think in itself is a fantastic resource. I've been kind of trying to keep caught up. There are a few that I haven't been able to read yet, but that resource of having all of those voices present and their lived experiences, I would say that is an excellent place for educators to definitely start if you haven't read those blogs. And then it looks like, Sosin, you just added something else in. So if you want to talk about that a little bit.
These are just different resources. So we put together several wakelets. We did one that was like cross content area. So how can you integrate the Arab narrative into like science, math, English? One that's very heavily English literature focused. And then the 30 days is just Arab voices that are shorter pieces that people can kind of integrate. And then we did a special event for NCTE last night, which was really celebrating Arab joy. And I think that's another thing that I really want to kind of just lift, is that we want to make sure that when we're celebrating these marginalized voices, we're not looking at it just from a deficit, tragic perspective. There's a lot of like sadness in a lot of the history of these marginalized communities, but there's also so much beauty and joy that helps to humanize them, like talking about the food, like talking about family, like talking about community. And so the Ode to Arab Voices is just a celebration of culture and Arab identity from a very mixed demographic of artists who joined us last night to really talk about that. And they're little video clips that people can actually take into their classrooms and share with their students or share with your teacher friends. And that's another thing, like as a tech organization, IDEA, like I know that's a big thing for us. Bring people who look like us into your classroom space and normalize that, right? Like every Wednesday, I teach in a district that's primarily Latin. We have our Asian students, our Arab students, and our Black students live in a third space because they're so small in number and there's almost no representation in staff for them. And so what I've done is every single Wednesday, I've had a lightning speaker from a different background kind of come to our classroom virtually. And the kids will tell you it's the best day of the week. They're looking forward to it and they love to see somebody who looks like them speaking at them from an expert perspective. So use technology to really diminish these borders and these classroom walls and really expand your community and connect your students to, even if you don't have Arab students, talking about the Arab narrative is so important in your classroom space, and maybe even more important when there are no students there, because you're humanizing and you're giving students the opportunity that if they're going into college and career worlds, they might engage with people who look like us for the first time. And it could be a very negative experience if they haven't had any exposure. So being intentional about really using technology to bring communities together and start to create that larger national community and cross border community is a really great way to also humanize that as well.
Thank you. I'd like to ask one final question. The time has flown by, so I would really love to ask one final question and then open it up for anyone else who might have additional questions after hearing you speak, if you're all okay with that. I think what I really want to ask you is going to draw on your own perspective again. So your own experiences as students, what educator practices were actually most harmful to you, and what was most supportive of you and your identity as an Arab American? I know that's there's a lot rolled into one, but I think sometimes, again, hearing those perspectives from what you have held on to, whether it impacted you negatively or positively, is impactful.
If I can go first.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to talk about the first experience as a student, because I think what a lot of marginalized people go through as young adults, they bury deep. And this was a memory that surfaced because of my thesis work, writing a poetic memoir. And I was in the 4th grade, and I was in geography class, and the teacher was having all the students come up and point to where they were on the map, what country they were from. And I'm Palestinian. So when I went up to point, my country was not on the map. And the teacher, who was a geography teacher, was like, "Oh, that's strange. Where's your country?" And that created such a divide within me, like not realize, because I was a 4th grader, so I didn't realize the maps had changed and things had, politics had happened, and my country didn't have a name on the map. And that created such a divide within my identities and understanding, like, who am I? How come I'm not visible to the world? And that stayed with me, and it was something I think I buried because it was only through like reflective writing that this memory surfaced and how long it had stayed with me. So sometimes these unintentional practices that are harmful, because I'm sure the teachers didn't intentionally mean that, but as a geography teacher, you should know geography and what's going on.
You would think, yes.
But that's something that really stayed with me, and it still to this day impacts me, because it wasn't until that moment that I realized being a Palestinian was being invisible. And that really shaped my perceptions of the world and myself. And then the next example I have is of one of my own students. I try to incorporate Arab authors, Muslim authors into my classroom, and I have a student who does cover her face completely by choice, and I introduced an author who also covered her face, and she came up to me about a week after I introduced the book, and she said, I never knew that girls that cover their faces could be published. And that was like heart-wrenching for me, but also very like uplifting, that I'm glad that she saw herself mirrored in the world. And that wasn't a perception. Like, we have all these negative stereotypes of women and what they can accomplish in the Arab world, but here we are in a very Western space, unintentionally and maybe subconsciously saying the same thing to them. You don't have a space. So it's a lot of the times the things that we don't do that are impacting our students.
Wow, thank you. Would anybody else like to contribute to that with your experiences?
I'll speak a little about mine. Mine is a little bit different because of my parents' decision, but I did go to public school until the 4th grade. And the one memory of marginalization that I could remember, I was in school at the time that The Lion King came out. And my last name is Mustafa. So one time my teacher called my last name Mufasa. And, even though I was a fan of the movie, the other kids started to pick up on that, and they started to repeat it, and it kind of like hurt me a little bit. And my parents kind of got involved, and eventually they decided, and my mother, since she was born in America, she had a way harsher experience growing up in the public school system and in her neighborhood, being like the only Arab family. So the bullying that she faced as you know, an Arab American, a Palestinian American, being used to hearing people say, go back to where you came from and things like that, and having to defend and say, well, this is where I came from. I was born here just like you. She and my father eventually looked for private school. So, you know, my entire life, I grew up in a private school with other Arab children and other Muslim children from non-Arab countries. So I kind of felt like I grew up in a bubble in a way. And I also ended up working in the school that I went to. So it was very easy for me to kind of bring up that pride and speak about the culture to my own community. But this year being my first time outside and being, you know, a minority among the staff that I'm with, it wasn't easy in the beginning. So I did feel those micro and macro aggressions from teachers and from students. You know, for some of my co-teachers, I might be I think the only Arab Muslim woman that they've ever worked with in their lives. So from one of my co-teachers, I always felt like kind of he gets surprised whenever I can teach a lesson in like, you know, a way that he feels is, you know, like a great lesson or something like that. Like Zainab said, is it because of what I look like and what I speak, or is it because of, you know, my own academic level at this point, right? So, you know, growing up in this way, and now as an adult, I'm like, okay, is that why my mother looked so hard and searched until she found a place? And later on, when I spoke to her, she kind of did tell me, you know, I felt like I had to shelter you and, you know, give you a safe space. But the beauty is now we can work together as teachers to create safe spaces for everybody. So nobody's parent has to go out there and search for, you know, a little niche to put their children in, you know. So, you know, a good conversation to have.
I think, Mona, you brought up a good point.
Mm-hmm.
Because your parents took you out of that school. I think if we expand this idea that if every Muslim student is bullied and doesn't feel like they have a sense of belonging, how many students are going to be pushed out of public schools or feel like they have no place in public schools? And I think that's a dangerous notion, to think that students feel so marginalized, even within the well-known marginalized communities, because I don't ever think, even growing up, that people considered me marginalized because I was Arab. We aren't taken under that like label. How many students have to be pushed out of our classrooms and into their own sections for us to realize something is missing in the way we are teaching these kids?
I think that is the perfect note for us to end on for the discussion, and we'll open it up to some questions, because I think it highlights the fact that this isn't a one and done discussion. You can't just come to this webinar and listen for an hour and suddenly it's solved. It's something that we consistently have to be aware of and work for. So I think that's what we have to continue, you know, on with this. It looks like I have a question. Yes, please go ahead, ask your question.
Actually, I just wanted to say thank you, Stephanie. This is awesome. Dr. Solson, it's so nice to see you. Zainab, Muna, Kefah. You know, we have waited so long for this. I'm decades and decades in education, and this is just wonderful, Stephanie. You did a great job. I want to mention one resource that I hope you all get a chance to read, and I think this tells us why this was possible. Why is it possible to marginalize everybody but dominant white culture? Read The Price of Nice. 4 or 5 years ago, I decided no longer will I sit by and just be nice when I see something's wrong against a person. And this is in my workplace. And I just couldn't keep doing that because, you know, everybody needs to know you can't, you know, celebrate Muslims in Ramadan and serve lunch. You know, anyway, I just hope you get a chance to read that book. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
No, thank you so much for being present, for listening, for contributing. the more voices we can spread and help center, that's what we want to do. You know, we are always looking for new ways that we can help celebrate the community. So we appreciate you being here. All right, anybody else have a question? I know we're at 4:29. Please feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to.
If we don't have any questions, I just want to say we really appreciate you being here. I know after school and at the end of the year and everybody's exhausted. I know we're all exhausted. And the fact that you're here is a testament to your advocacy for all kids. And we appreciate that, really.
Thank you, everyone, very much. Thank you to our panelists. This has been phenomenal. I feel like I have learned a lot as well. I appreciate you sharing your experiences, your voices. If you missed it, I dropped the link for the PDH into the chat. So I will do that one more time for you. You can grab that and the recording will be sent to you after Heather has finalized it. So thank you again, everyone. I really appreciate your time today.